Hello friends, I am Chevee. Welcome to my shed. How are you today? How's life in your world? How's things where you are? Hope everything is good and great. Everything is fantastic here, and today we have another book review. I've been enjoying doing these a lot lately, and people seem to enjoy when I review things, so we'll just keep doing it for a while and see what happens. I hesitate to turn this into a book review channel, but whatever. Today we're going to talk about Unchained Shadows Elderrealm Book 2 by Scott King. First thing, a couple of things to get out of the way here. One, Scott King is a personal friend of mine. Two, Scott King did not provide me with this copy and did not request a review from me. I purchased this on Amazon with my own money. That being said, Scott did provide me with a copy of Elderrealm's Book 1, Wrath of Dragons. He offered me this in trade for some labor, so I kind of paid for this one. And I purchased this one because I really enjoyed Book 1. And to give you the straight up front, I really enjoyed Book 2. I've actually read this a few months back, and I think I mentioned that I had read a book, but I wasn't going to talk about it quite yet. Because at that point, I read this, I would say, probably in August. And this was the first book I had read during quarantine. I had not read anything since March. That's not technically true, but by that I mean I haven't read any novels since March. And I usually read 20 to 50 books a year or something like that. So it's kind of weird for me to not be reading anything for that length of time. And I wanted to read something, but I wasn't sure what. And I remembered that Scott had released Unchained Shadows last year. I've been patiently waiting on a hardback because I'm a hardback guy, and he still hasn't released it, so I just purchased the paperback. And I can tell you, this is the first of the Amazon kind of bigger print paperbacks I've ever had. This is really nice. I actually really enjoy this format. It's a little beat up. I read this book in about less than 48 hours. I read it very quick, and this is not a small boy. This is a 600-page book. So I read this pretty quick. If you have not read Wrath of Dragons, some of the things I'm about to say are spoilers, but not necessarily spoilers for this book. We'll talk spoilers in a second. But Wrath of Dragons is a super fun, quick and easy to read, like, I don't know, 400-page-ish story about dragons and friends and saving a kingdom. You know, kind of I don't want to say it's a standard fantasy because Scott's world is anything but standard, and I think that's part of the reason I really enjoyed Wrath of Dragons. It is about a dragon, but it's about a dragon who's very different from the rest of the dragons. It's about a magician who is very different from his master, and it's about a girl who goes against everything to save her kingdom. And it's a big quest set in a weird world that's not traditional fantasy, with non-traditional fantasy races and weird creatures and all that sort of stuff, but it told in a very inviting and friendly way. Unchained Shadows picks up, you know, basically at the end of that. It kicks right off into the next chapter of this story. Scott has told me personally that there is something like, I think, 9 books planned. I'm not positive, but I believe that was the number he told me. He told me this years ago, so it's very possible I'm forgetting it. But this book definitely advances the story, and it's also... I almost want to say it's harder to read, but it's not. It's not harder to read. It's just a lot more. There's a lot more going on in this book than in Wrath of Dragons. The 3 main characters, we have Doug and Carter, the dragon, and Alex, the queen. This book picks their storylines up and follows them, but what it does differently is it's 3 completely separate storylines. And in fact, there's more like 4 completely separate storylines in this book, because there's another character that gets introduced early in this book that we follow their storyline. So we have like these 4 interwoven storylines, all wrapping and weaving throughout the book. And one of the remarkable things I'll say about the way Scott wrote this is I never felt troubled by jumping between storylines. A lot of times when I read books that have multiple POV storylines, where they're very separate stories, these are four very separate stories. Well, two of them are working together. The other two are very separate stories. The characters are completely different areas of the world, completely oblivious to what their friends are doing. They're not sending eagles or whatever to get missives. They're completely oblivious. So there's these four storylines. Two of them come together, merge together pretty early. The others come together, and then, or the others kind of leave from all of that. And the nice thing is, when he does this jumping, I never felt, you know. A lot of times when those things happen, writers like to leave a storyline on a cliffhanger, and so you're like antsy to get back to it. The problem that I have with that is when I leave a storyline on a cliffhanger and I jump to the other storyline, I'm already like kind of out of it. Like, I'm not interested in what's going on right now because I'm still stuck on that cliffhanger. Scott didn't leave me with that feeling at all. There might have been a few chapter jumps that were, quote, cliffhangers, but I didn't feel like I was like it was a commercial break that I was waiting to get through. Is the only way I can explain it. I felt like every chapter, every jump, and sometimes I will say a few of the storylines there's multiple chapters back to back, so it's not always jumping every chapter. But every storyline jump, I felt like the chunk that Scott told me during that time was a full and complete part of the narrative, and I wasn't antsy about the jump to the next storyline. Often I was excited because it was like, oh, I want to know what happened. You know, when I turn the page and I see the chapter marker is, let's see here. I see the chapter marker is the signet ring, and I know this is going to be an Alex chapter. I suddenly get really excited, like, oh, this is cool. That being said, there is a lot of POVs in this book. Those four storylines have multiple POVs within them, so there is a good bit of dipping and diving in between a whole lot of stuff going on. And it can be a little bit cumbersome to keep track of at times. But I feel like if you're, a fantasy reader, you're used to that, and none of what Scott does in here is confusing at all. The other really nice thing about Scott's writing is this is a huge book. 600 pages is a pretty hefty book, and it's in a very unfamiliar world with very unfamiliar units of measurement and very unfamiliar creatures and races and mythologies. And this book does not weigh you down with all of that stuff. One of the things I love about the series so far is Scott lets you be fully aware that this world is not normal. There's a whole bunch of not normal stuff, meaning not normal to humans, meaning not normal to fantasy. But he doesn't bog you down with just vomiting explanation of everything. He tells you enough to say, there's ollops, and ollops are the beasts of burden in this world. And you basically get the understanding that they are long-necked, turtle-shelled elephants. That's all you need to know. We don't need to know what color they are, or that's it. They're big, they have shells, and people ride on them. Let's move on, right? And that's the kind of stuff that he does throughout the whole books, both of these books, with the world building that really makes it feel good. When Scott does tease you, he doesn't tease you with the storyline, he teases you with the world. And I find that to be pretty fascinating. He basically says, here's something new about the world, we'll get back to that later. And lets you just kind of go, okay. And it comes up eventually, and you'll go, oh, okay, now that all kind of makes sense to what he said before. When that happens, though, I will say, the timing is usually pretty great. Oftentimes when an author will tease me something about a world or tease me something about a character, and I don't get to resolve that tease until chapters later, I will find myself going back and rereading the original tease. I've never had to do that with Scott. He always makes me feel like, hey, wink, here's what actually was going on. And you go, oh, okay. And I don't have to go back and reference, like, what is he talking about there? I don't remember. I remember feeling that something there was left off, but I don't know what it was. I never felt that. If you like fantasy that is epic, that is engaging, that is, I hesitate to say quest-based, but it's a very At this point so far in this series, the quest is we're saving the world, but we don't know from what, and we're figuring that out as we go. This is it. This is that kind of thing. Like, there is no big prophecy that we know of yet. There is something going on, and people know about it, or they have assumed it's going to happen. But so far, we haven't been hit with the farm boy prophecy, or the farm girl prophecy, or the end of the world is coming, and we all must do whatever. We know that the end of the world is happening right now, and we've got to figure that out. So it's very seat of the pants. You're figuring it out just as the characters are figuring it out. And that's all I'm going to say before I talk a little bit about spoilers. And so if you want to read the book and you haven't read either yet, please go pick them up and read them and tell me what you think, because I really do think this is an amazing, currently, set of 2 books. Scott says the next book will be out next year, so hopefully 3 books soon. So here's some spoilers. I really like some of the relationships that got built in this book. The relationship between Doug and Cain. Doug is the fat dragon and Cain is the shapeshifter, and they got married in the first book to get out of a situation. They got soul bonded essentially in the first book to get out of a situation. That relationship is amazing. It's so rich in here. Like, they're bonded and they don't want to be. Like, they hate each other. They're enemies, but they're bonded, and so they can feel each other, and they come to be somewhat of a symbiotic relationship because of that. And that feels really super awesome. Like, really super awesome, right? Carter going to assassin school and teaching is really fun. I think, knowing Scott personally, I know Scott personally. Scott was a teacher. And so when I read these books, I get to see a little bit of Scott in all of the things. Scott is a foodie. He loves food, and he writes a lot about food. Scott was a teacher, and he writes a lot about teaching in here. Scott is flamboyant sometimes, and he writes characters that are flamboyant in here. And that's all really, really fun. But the relationships that he built between Doug and Cain, and between the girl whose name I'm completely forgetting right now, and Owen, is amazing. There's a new character that gets introduced who survives the big bad in the beginning of the book, and she becomes a part of something bigger that she's not aware of, and her and Owen become a bit of a grandfather, an old man trying to teach the young something, and she's a bit of an abrasive teen, but I don't think she's actually a teenager. I don't know how old she is. She's college age, so whatever. I love that relationship. There was a couple of instances in the book where I was a little bit confused by point of view. There's one instance in particular throughout the book. Carter is being talked to, and we don't know who is talking to him. It's inside of his head kind of thing. And then there's a chapter that starts off where there's a we're not sure who person, and they're being talked to inside their head. And it turns out it's not Carter. It turns out it's somebody else, and it was really a bit confusing for a few paragraphs, and I had to go back and reread that part. That was the one time that I felt a little bit awkward by it. But overall, the Shoal, or I think that's how they're pronounced, are an amazing bad guy, because in the first book we got bad guy who is trying to save the world by destroying it and killing dragons, and we had to go stop that. In this book, we find out that bad guy had good intentions, he just went about it all wrong, but the new bad guy, the Shale, are just, devouring creatures. And so we can't depend on them to have human morals. We can't depend on them to, to back off because they realize they're wrong. That's never going to happen. They're just devourers, and we have to save the world from them. So Amazing book. I read it in literally less than 2 days. In fact, I texted Scott on day one of reading and told him a couple of errors that I found, like in the first part of the book. I found a couple of directional errors. I was like, I don't think they went that way. They went this way. And then the next day I texted him and said, I loved it. It was a great book. And he's like, you were just reading, you were just in chapter 5. And I'm like, I read quick and I loved it. So I couldn't put it down. His writing style is super inviting. There's nothing complex in here. If anything is complex besides the amount of POVs in this book, it's the things I was saying. He tells you things about the world, but he doesn't tell you what they are. Units of measurement are a good example. You have no clue. Like, you're just, okay. Weeks and time, days, we're not really sure how long all of that stuff is. It doesn't matter is the secret sauce. Like, who cares? And characters will often mention things just as if they were a normal thing that you, the reader, have no clue about. So there's a little bit of that is, I hesitate to even call it confusing because it's on purpose. Scott's not weighing you down with just flowery word building. He's just moving the story along. He's giving you things like, here's this. If you want to find out about it, maybe we'll come back to it later. But if you don't, it doesn't impact the story at all, because this is really a story about a bunch of crazy characters going their own way, and eventually, they'll all come back together. So that's my review of Unchained Shadows by Scott King, Book 2 of the Elderrealm. I would say it's a solid 8.5 out of 10. I've never really given numbers. I think it's a great read. I think it really is great. So I really encourage you to pick these two books up and give them a shot. Thank you for being here as always. Thank you for liking and commenting, subscribing, being amazing friends and wonderful people. I really appreciate you. And I will see you again tomorrow. Today's word you should know to sound smart is convivial. It's an adjective meaning fond of feasting, drinking, and companionship. One does not leave a convivial party before closing time. Winston Churchill, a British statesman and orator. Convivial. CONVIVIAL.